He was left at the auction shackled in chains until a quiet man bought her, unlocked her, and walked away without saying a word. This happened in Fort Braxton, Wyoming Territory, February 1874. Late winter gripped the frontier town in a hard fist. Snowbanks piled high along the muddy main street, the wind slicing between the false fronts of saloons and trading posts. At the far edge of town, the auction yard stood half-sheltered under a sagging canvas awning, its wooden platform slick with frost, smoke from pipes, and the sharp tang of chewing tobacco mixed with the stale heat of unwashed bodies packed close. Somewhere nearby, a saloon piano played out of tune, its notes drowned by the rough murmur of voices and the rattle of coins. A sharp command cut the air. "Bring her out." The gate at the side of the platform swung open, and Evelyn was led forward. Chains bit into the skin at her wrists and ankles, the iron frigid against bruises old and new. Her dress was torn at the hem, its thin fabric doing nothing against the cold. A purple bruise shadowed her cheekbone, and her hair, once neatly braided, hung loose in wind-blown strands. She stumbled at the step-up, the chain between her ankles scraping over the frozen planks, and the crowd leaned forward to see her better. "She's healthy enough," the auctioneer barked, his voice worn ragged from years of shouting. He yanked her arm to turn her toward the bidders like a rancher displaying livestock. "Can work the fields or the kitchens? Who'll start me at $20? A few men called out, their voices roughened by whiskey. Laughter rippled through the knot of onlookers. One man whistled low. Another grinned and called, "Turn her this way." Evelyn kept her eyes on the scuffed boards beneath her feet, jaw tight, against the chill and the humiliation. From the far edge of the crowd, a figure stood apart. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wrapped in a heavy coat of dark fur. The hood hung back, revealing a face carved with hard lines, a short beard shadowing his jaw. His eyes, a cold, steady gray, were fixed on her, not with hunger, not with pity, but with a stillness that seemed to take in everything. The auctioneer's chant rose and fell. 30? 35? Who's got 40? The tall man lifted one gloved hand. His voice, low but firm, carried over the noise. "I'll take her." The bidding stopped as if the words had cut the air. The auctioneer blinked, then grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. 40 it is. Sold. The man, Thaddeus, mounted the steps without hurry. He didn't look at the auctioneer. Instead, he turned to the guard holding her chain. "Key." The guard frowned, but handed it over. Thaddeus fit the iron into the lock at her wrists. The shackle gave a sharp click, swinging open. He did the same at her ankles. The last length of chain slipped from her skin and fell hard against the platform with a clanging note that silenced even the hecklers in the back. Evelyn lifted her eyes to him for the first time. His gaze met hers, calm, steady, unreadable. Without a word, he turned and stepped down from the platform, moving, through the parting crowd toward the snow-swept Main Street. His boots left deep impressions in the churned slush. The wind caught at the fur on his collar, and within moments, his figure began to fade into the swirling white. Evelyn stood in place, the cold biting deep where iron had been. The auctioneer had already turned to his next lot, barking at the crowd, but she barely heard him. Her hands hung free. She stepped down from the platform slowly, each movement feeling unreal, and turned her face toward the street where he had gone. The snow was falling harder now, his tracks already blurring, but she watched until the last trace of him vanished, into the winter storm. Somewhere in the hollow ache of her chest, a small, unfamiliar warmth took root. She was free, and the man who had made it so had asked for nothing in return. The wind had not eased since the auction, driving loose snow in thin, stinging veils down the empty street. Evelyn walked with her head bent, her arms wrapped tight around her middle. The crowd had scattered to saloons and warm stoves, leaving only the creak of swinging signs and the crunch of her own boots over crusted ice. An old woman in a patched shawl stepped out of a doorway as Evelyn passed. "You look half-starved, child." She pressed a small wedge of coarse bread into Evelyn's hand. Before Evelyn could speak, the woman shook her head and went back inside, the door shutting against the cold. Evelyn stood alone, the bread rough in her palm. She tore off. A piece, chewing without tasting. There was nowhere to go, no name to call upon. But in the restless churn of her thoughts, one image kept returning. Gray eyes under the hood of a fur-lined coat, steady and silent. She remembered the sound of chains hitting wood. Pulling her shawl tighter, Evelyn turned her back on town and began to walk. The snow deepened quickly beyond the last buildings, the road narrowing to a trail between bare cottonwoods. Her breath rose in quick frosted bursts, and each step grew heavier as drifts swallowed her boots. The forest closed in, black pines pressing together, their boughs sagging with white. Wind funneled between the trunks, a cutting blade against her cheeks. She tried to keep her bearings, following what she thought was a trapper's path, but the trail vanished in a wind-blown hollow. Hours, or what felt like hours, slipped by. The bread was gone, her fingers numb and stiff inside thin gloves. She stumbled over a buried root, catching herself on her knees. The snow seeped through her skirt, burning cold. She pushed on. Her vision wavered at the edges, the world dimming into gray. Each breath scraped her throat raw. Her hands and feet no longer ached. They felt heavy, foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. Then, faint at first, then stronger, came a flicker of yellow through the trees. She blinked, afraid it was a trick of the snow. But when she turned toward it, the glow steadied. The cabin stood in a small clearing, its roof banked high with snow, smoke curling from the chimney. The light came from a window beside the door. She reached the porch and managed one knock before her knees gave way. The door opened. Thaddeus filled the frame, taller than she remembered, his shoulders blocking the storm behind him. For a heartbeat, he simply looked at her, hair tangled with snow, skin pale beneath windburn, eyes dulled with exhaustion. Then he stepped forward and caught her before she hit the boards. Without a word, he carried her inside. The heat struck her like a wave, dizzying after the cold. He sat her down in a low chair beside a stone hearth, where a fire crackled bright, then reached for a thick woolen blanket hanging over the back of the chair. He wrapped it around her shoulders, tucking it close until she was cocooned in its weight. He crouched at her feet, fingers moving with deliberate care to unlace her boots. They were stiff with ice. He eased them off slowly, pulling away sodden stockings. Her toes were white at the tips. He set both feet near the fire, then brought over a small kettle from the stove. Steam curled from the spout as he poured dark liquid into a tin cup. He pressed it into her hands, closing her fingers around the warmth. "Drink," he said quietly. She obeyed, the heat of the tea chasing the ache from her throat. He didn't ask why she had come, didn't scold her for the risk. He only added another log to the fire, the flames leaping high, and glanced at her once, to be sure she was steady in the chair. The weight in her limbs began to ease. The harsh rattle of the wind outside faded into a dull hum, softened by the fire's steady crackle. She let the cup rest in her lap, her eyelids too heavy to hold open. The last thing she felt before sleep claimed her was the warmth of the blanket at her shoulders, and the sense, fragile but certain, that for the first time in many months, she was safe. Snow crunched under their boots as they moved deeper into the trees. The air was sharp, every breath a small cloud. Thaddeus walked ahead, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the underbrush for movement. Evelyn followed a few paces behind, carrying a sack for the traps and anything they might gather along the way. They had been out for over an hour, and the quiet, Rhythm of the hunt was steady. Step, pause, scan. Thaddeus crouched now and then to check a trap, resetting one, pocketing the catch from another. Evelyn knelt to collect kindling when she could, tucking the small branches into her pack. It was as she straightened from gathering a handful of pine cones that the sound reached her. Low, guttural, close. She froze. From between two trees, a massive black bear emerged, its winter-thick coat bristling, its head swinging toward them. Thaddeus reacted instantly, lifting his rifle. The crack of the shot shattered the stillness, but the bullet only grazed past, splintering bark behind the animal. The bear bellowed and charged. "Thaddeus!" Evelyn's voice rang sharp in the cold air. He was already reloading, but the bear was closing the distance too fast. Evelyn's gaze dropped. There, in the snow beside his last trap, lay the short-barreled pistol he had set down moments earlier. She lunged for it, her gloves brushing. Snow from the grip as she brought it up with both hands. The bear was almost on them. She didn't think, just aimed for the largest mass she could see, its shoulder, and pulled the trigger. The recoil jarred her arms, but the shot struck home. The bear staggered, its charge breaking as it roared in pain. Thaddeus took that moment, lifting his rifle again. His second shot was clean and final. The woods fell silent, except for the ragged sound of their breathing. Evelyn realized she was still holding the pistol, her hands trembling slightly. Thaddeus stepped to her side, his own rifle lowered now. He looked at her for a long moment, snowflakes melting in his hair and on the rough line of his jaw. Then, he set a hand on her shoulder, not heavy, but steady. "You kept us both alive," he said, and for the first time since she had met him, his mouth curved into a real, unguarded smile. The knot of fear in her chest loosened. She had come into these woods thinking she was only an extra weight for him to carry, but now she felt something shift. She had acted, and it had mattered. They stood there for a moment longer, the bear lying still a few yards away, the wind moving softly through the pines. Then Thaddeus picked up the pistol from her hands, checked it, and slid it back into his belt. "Let's get this done," he said quietly, nodding toward the path home. Evelyn followed, her steps lighter than when they had begun, the snow beneath her boots no longer feeling quite so cold. The afternoon was quiet, the kind of stillness that settled deep into the walls when the snow outside fell slow and steady. Evelyn moved about the cabin with a rhythm she had grown used to, straightening the bedrolls, sweeping away the bits of pine needles tracked in from their boots, and wiping the wood counters smooth. She came to the small desk in the corner, its surface worn to a dull sheen from years of use. A few books were stacked neatly at one end, a tin cup filled with pencils and bits of charcoal. She reached for a cloth to dust the top, her hand brushing against the edge of the top drawer. It slid open with a soft creak. Inside there wasn't much, just a folded piece of parchment, a small wooden carving of a bird, and a scarf. It was made of wool, the weave loose in places. The once bright yarn faded to a muted cream. Along the edges, threads had frayed, curling, softly like old paper. Evelyn lifted it out with both hands, feeling the surprising lightness of it. She smoothed it over her palms, noting the faint scent of cedar that clung to the fibers. It was clearly a woman's scarf, delicate and cared for long past its prime. She turned at the sound of the door opening. Thaddeus stepped inside, brushing. Snow from his shoulders, his expression as steady as ever until his eyes fell on what she was holding. He stopped. The change was subtle but sharp. His gaze dropped to the scarf and stayed there, his jaw tightening just enough for her to notice. "I was dusting," she began, her voice low. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," he said quickly, though his tone was heavier than usual. He stepped closer, taking the scarf from her hands with a care that was almost reverent. He held it for a moment, his fingers tracing the worn fringe before he spoke again. "It belonged to my sister," he said, The word seemed to weigh something in the air. Evelyn didn't move, sensing this was not a story he told often. She was younger than me, head full of stubborn ideas, always running ahead of where she should be. I left her one winter to check the traps farther north, thought I'd be back in a few days. He paused, his thumb brushing over a snag in the wool. When I returned, she was gone, sold off while I was gone, to a place in town no one walks into without shame. Evelyn's chest tightened. I looked for her, he continued, voice quieter now. Found her weeks later in the middle of a blizzard. She'd run, but the cold, it got to her before I did. The silence that followed was thick, the crackle of the fire suddenly loud in the small space. Evelyn's eyes drifted to the scarf again, now cradled in his large hands as if it were something breakable. She wore it every winter, Thaddeus said, almost to himself. I kept it because it's all I had left. Evelyn's mind filled with the pieces she had not understood before. The way he had appeared at the auction without hesitation, the immediate release of her chains, the quiet distance he kept. It wasn't just kindness. It was a vow. You saved me, she said softly. His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment something unguarded flickered there. Don't ask why. I wasn't going to let it happen again, he said simply. She took a slow breath, the weight of his loss settling alongside her own. Without thinking too much about it, she stepped closer. Her hand found his, fingers brushing against the roughness of his skin. She didn't try to speak. There were no words big enough to cover what they both carried. The touch was enough. He didn't pull away. His grip didn't tighten either, just stayed steady and warm. They stood like that for a while, the snow still falling outside, the fire casting a soft glow over the room. When Evelyn finally let go, the quiet between them felt different, not empty, but shared. He folded the scarf carefully, returning it to the drawer, then closed it without a sound. Neither of them spoke as they moved back to their work, but the air had shifted. Evelyn knew without doubt that the silence was no longer a barrier between them. It was an understanding. The night was cold enough to bite through the thickest wool. The moon hung low, half hidden by drifting clouds, its pale light spilling over the snowy ridge. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow across the room. Thaddeus was mending a leather strap at the table when it happened. A sound, faint but distinct, cut through the stillness. A dog's bark, then another. He froze. Evelyn looked up from the quilt she was folding. What is it? He raised a hand for silence, his eyes narrowing toward the door. The bark grew closer, joined by the crunch of boots over hard snow, too many for it to be a passing traveler. They've found us, he murmured. He rose, moving with deliberate quiet to the gun rack. From it, he took his Winchester and checked the chamber. Then he crossed to the window and blew out the lamp, plunging the cabin into shadow. The sudden darkness made the outside sound sharper, the low voices, the muffled laughter of men who thought themselves hunters. Stay low, he told her, voice low and firm. A moment later, the first shot cracked through the night, shattering a pane of glass near the door. Thaddeus dropped to one knee, returning fire through the window. A man's shout echoed, followed by the rapid thud of retreating steps. But more came. Shapes moved in the tree line, shadows slipping between shadows. Bullets slammed into the cabin's outer walls, sending splinters into the air. Thaddeus shifted positions, firing with calm precision, each shot deliberate. Evelyn could hear him breathing evenly, as if he'd done this 100 times before. Then, a sharp, ragged cry. Thaddeus jerked back, his rifle clattering to the floor. Evelyn's eyes caught the dark bloom spreading across his shoulder. "You're hit!" she gasped. "I'm fine, Dower," he gritted out, grabbing his revolver with his good hand. She darted toward the entrance just as one of the men tried to force it open. Without thinking, she snatched the hunting knife from the shelf. The door burst inward a few inches before she slammed her shoulder into it, driving the blade hard through the gap. A curse rang out, followed by retreating footsteps and the crunch of snow as the intruder stumbled back. Thaddeus kept firing, his shots spaced to push them farther away. Another yell, then silence, save for the heavy breathing of men in the dark. Somewhere out there, one of them shouted, "Town's too close! We'll come back!" The crunch of boots faded into the trees. The dogs barked once more, then went quiet. Evelyn stayed at the door, knife still in her grip, until the night settled again. Only then did she turn back. Thaddeus was leaning against the wall, his revolver limp in his hand, his breathing uneven. "Thaddeus." She dropped the knife and was at his side in seconds. The blood from his shoulder was flowing too fast, soaking through the rough fabric of his shirt. "Sit down," she ordered, guiding him toward the table. He didn't argue, which frightened her more than the gunfire. She tore a strip from the cleanest cloth she could find and pressed it hard against the wound. His jaw tightened, a hiss escaping between his teeth. "It's just a graze." She shook her head fiercely. "You've lost too much blood for it to be just anything." Her hands trembled, but she kept pressure steady, the cloth warming quickly under her palms. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in her mind. For a moment they didn't speak. His eyes stayed on hers, and she saw there the same resolve he'd carried since the day she met him. Stubborn, immovable, but not unkind. When the bleeding began to slow, she exhaled shakily, binding the wound as best she could. "You should have let me take the first shot," she muttered, more to cover the tightness in her throat than anything. His mouth curved, faint, but real. Couldn't risk it. She tied the knot in the cloth, her fingers brushing his arm just above the wound. "And I couldn't risk losing you." The fire was almost out, the cabin still in shadow, but Evelyn didn't move to relight it. She stayed beside him, keeping her hand firm over the bandage, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. Outside, the mountain night closed in again, cold, vast, and silent. But inside, the danger had passed. For now, the storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in a pale hush. Light filtered through the narrow gap in the cabin shutters, spilling in soft strips across the floorboards. The scent of wood smoke lingered, mingling with the faint tang of gunpowder still clinging to the air. Evelyn sat beside the bed, her hands steady as she unwound the blood-stiffened bandage from Thaddeus's shoulder. His skin was mottled with bruises, the angry red line of a bullet's graze cutting across the muscle. "You could have walked away," she said quietly, her voice barely, above the whisper of the fire. "But you stayed for me." Thaddeus's gaze found hers, his eyes shadowed but unflinching. "Couldn't lose someone again," he murmured, voice rough with fatigue. "Not you." They held each other's eyes, and for the first time there was no wall between them, no unspoken debt, no guarded space, only the truth. When the wound was cleaned and freshly wrapped, Thaddeus lay back, exhaustion pulling at him. Evelyn smoothed the blanket over him, her fingers lingering for a moment at his hand before she rose. By the end of the week, he was strong enough to walk without wavering. The cabin felt too still now, too bound to the memory of that night. So they packed light, just what they could carry, and set out for the valley. The path wound through the same forest where she had nearly frozen to death. The snow was thinning now, giving way to patches of dark earth and pale grass. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Evelyn said. Thaddeus glanced at her. "It's the same forest, just not the same way we're walking it." They spoke as they went about. Land in the lower valley, a garden, a hen house, maybe even a horse for Samuel, should they ever have one. Maybe a little one running around, Thaddeus added so casually it made Evelyn smile. By midday, they reached the small churchyard tucked into the slope of the valley. The graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, their names carved deep. Thaddeus stopped before one weathered and gray. Evelyn knelt, brushing snow from the ground, and placed a handful of wild violets there. "She'd be proud of you," she said. He didn't answer, but his fingers tightened gently around hers. The rest of the day carried them to town, where life bustled, despite the lingering winter chill. They bought links of sturdy pine, sacks of seed for spring planting, and a wide-paned window that Evelyn had already decided would face the morning sun. At the general store, Thaddeus picked up a folded dress in soft sky-blue cotton and laid it on the counter. "For the lady of the house," the storekeeper said warmly. Evelyn felt her cheeks heat, but Thaddeus only gave the faintest knowing smile. By the time they started back up the mountain trail, the air had shifted warmer, fragrant with thawing earth. Snow melt trickled into narrow streams and pale shoots pushed through the ground. As they rounded a bend, Evelyn laughed softly. "We might need more room someday." Thaddeus studied her face, the corners of his mouth turning. "Someday soon." They reached the cabin just as the sun poured gold across the valley. The light filled the doorway as they stepped inside, carrying with them lumber, seeds, and the quiet certainty that they were building more than walls. That night, the fire burned bright, casting its glow over their small table. Evelyn sat close enough to hear the steady rhythm of Thaddeus's breathing, the sense of danger behind them replaced by something deeper. Peace. The cabin walls no longer felt like shelter against the world. They felt like home. Spring had come. To the mountain at last. Snow melt ran in silver ribbons down the slopes, feeding the streams that sang over smooth stones. The meadow below the cabin blazed with wildflowers, purple lupine and yellow buttercups, nodding in the breeze. Evelyn stood on the porch, sunlight glinting in her hair, her eyes searching the line of trees where Thaddeus was making his way back. A bundle of cut timbers rested on his shoulder, his stride steady, sure-footed over the softening ground. Behind her, the sharp bark of laughter rang out. Samuel, their 4-year-old son, darted past her legs, clutching a wriggling puppy to his chest. "Mama, look! He's chasing me!" The little dog yipped, tail wagging furiously as Samuel danced away from imaginary pursuit. "Careful there, Sam," Thaddeus called as he reached the porch, lowering the timbers to the ground with a soft thud. Evelyn stepped forward to take one of the beams. Together, the three of them carried the wood inside. They were adding a new room, Samuel's own space with a window facing the sunrise, so the first light would spill across his bed each morning. When the work paused, Evelyn sat with Thaddeus on the porch steps, Samuel rolling in the grass with the pup. "Do you think he'll love this place as much as we do?" she asked. "If he grows up with laughter in these walls," Thaddeus said, eyes following their son, "he will." "I already do," Samuel shouted without looking up, his voice bubbling with certainty. They both laughed, the sound mingling with the wind in the pines. The days were filled with small acts of care. Thaddeus built Samuel a bookshelf, carving little animals into the wood. Evelyn knitted a new blanket for their boy, the yarn the deep green of the valley lake in summer. Samuel helped her plant flowers around the porch, his small hands dark with soil, his grin wide as he declared each row perfect. As evening fell, the three of them settled on the porch to watch the sun sink behind the ridgeline. The sky turned to molten gold, then to rose and violet. Samuel rested his head in Evelyn's lap, his eyelids drooping. Thaddeus's hand found her, shoulder warm and solid. "We've come a long way from that day at the auction," he said quietly. Evelyn's fingers closed around his. "And we're never going back." From his pocket, Thaddeus drew a small silver bracelet. 3 letters were etched into the band: E, T, and S. "This is for the family we built," he told her. Evelyn slipped it over her wrist, the metal cool against her skin. Samuel's tiny fingers brushed the letters. That means we're together forever, right? Right, Thaddeus said. His voice was steady, but his eyes softened in the way they only did for the two people sitting beside him. Night fell slow and gentle. The windows of the cabin glowed golden against the dark. Inside, Samuel's laughter bubbled up again as the puppy tumbled across the floor. Outside, the wild flowers stirred in the night air, and the mountains stood silent and strong as if keeping watch. In the shelter they built together with love that outlasted the storms, every sunrise found the Cole family still standing, stronger, warmer, and home at last. And that's how high in the wild mountains of the American West, Evelyn, Thaddeus, and little Samuel found a peace they never thought they'd see. A life built from courage, trust, and love that weathered every storm. If you enjoyed this journey into the untamed frontier and the hearts that found each other there, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories. There are more tales waiting for you, stories of grit, romance, and the quiet moments that mean everything. Stay with us for the next ride. The West is wide and love is out there.